Good evening, and welcome back to Sleep Current. This is another History Explained Before Sleep episode, and tonight, I've been reading through a case from 1629 that I didn't expect to linger in my mind the way it has. In isolation, hierarchy does not disappear, it mutates. On paper, it sounds almost routine. A Dutch East India Company ship, the Batavia, runs aground off the coast of Australia. 17th century navigation was imperfect. Longitude couldn't be measured accurately at sea. Ships often sailed too far east before turning north toward Java. So a wreck, by itself, isn't extraordinary. At first, I assumed this would be another example of maritime miscalculation. A tragic accident, difficult conditions, maybe some loss of life. But the deeper I went into the records, the less it felt like a simple shipwreck story. Because most of the passengers survived. They reached small coral islands in what's now known as the Houtman Abrolhos. Flat terrain, almost no fresh water, little vegetation. And then something happened that shifts the entire trajectory of the case. Within days, the senior company official, Francisco Pelsaert, left in a longboat to seek help in Batavia. The distance was roughly 3,000 kilometers. It was a desperate but rational decision. But it meant that more than 200 people were left behind. Soldiers, sailors, merchants, women, children, and no highest-ranking authority. When I started reading the interrogations taken after rescue, one thing became clear. The violence that followed the wreck wasn't spontaneous. It unfolded in phases, and some of the individuals later responsible had already been in conflict before the ship ever touched the reef. That part is important, because it means the wreck didn't create instability. It removed the structure that had been containing it. And the more I looked at it, the less this felt like a survival story. It felt like something that had been waiting for the right conditions. So before we move on to the islands themselves, we need to slow down and look at the voyage, and at the tensions that were already in place long before the hull split open in the dark. The Batavia left the Dutch Republic in October of 1628. It was newly built. This was its maiden voyage. On board were over 300 people, company officials, professional soldiers, experienced sailors, a few civilian passengers, several women and children. It also carried a large quantity of silver coins, intended for trade in Asia. This was not a small operation. The Dutch East India Company did not run informal voyages. Hierarchy was strict. Command structures were clear. Punishments at sea could be severe. That part is well documented across company records from the period, which is why what began happening during the voyage matters. One of the passengers was a man named Jeronimus Cornelisz. He was not a captain, not a naval officer. He was an apothecary, educated, articulate, financially unstable before departure. Later testimony suggests that during the journey, conversations began circulating about seizing the ship. Not immediately, not openly, but gradually. Those claims come from interrogations conducted after rescue, so we have to treat them carefully. People under threat of execution sometimes say what investigators want to hear, but multiple accounts refer to similar discussions, which suggests something had been forming long before the reef. There were also tensions between the ship's captain, Arian Jacobs, and the senior company representative, Francisco Pelsaert. That conflict appears in later records as well. It did not explode into open confrontation, but it existed. By the time the Batavia approached the western coast of Australia in June 1629, the voyage was not entirely stable beneath the surface. Then, in the early hours of June 4th, the ship struck coral. The impact came at night. The hull was compromised. The Batavia did not disappear instantly beneath the water. It broke apart gradually. Survivors made their way onto nearby islands. And for a brief moment, the situation looked survivable. But survival is not the same as order, and the next decision would determine which direction events moved. After the wreck, the immediate concern was water. The islands were small and exposed, and the first surveys suggested there was almost none available. That assessment is what led Francisco Pelsaert to make his decision. He, Captain Jacobs, and a small group took one of the longboats and attempted the voyage to Batavia. It was a dangerous calculation, roughly 3,000 kilometers across open ocean, but remaining in place without fresh water seemed worse. They left, and with them went formal authority. What remained was a fragmented structure. There were still soldiers present, there were still weapons, there were still company ranks, but there was no senior official with undisputed command. In most maritime disasters, hierarchy tightens after crisis. Orders become clearer. Survival depends on coordination. Here, the opposite happened. Cornelius did not immediately seize power. There was no dramatic declaration. Instead, influence appears to have shifted gradually. According to later court testimony, he began positioning himself as a central organizer, managing supplies, directing movements between islands, and identifying individuals he considered unreliable. It's important to stress that much of what we know about these weeks comes from interrogations conducted after rescue. Confessions were taken. Witness statements were compared. Some accused men blamed others in attempts to reduce their own punishment. Even so, a pattern emerges. Certain individuals were isolated. Strong soldiers were separated under various pretexts. Small groups were sent to distant islets. At first, this could be interpreted as resource management, but over time, it became clear that these separations were not temporary. People began to disappear. Some were drowned. Some were stabbed. Others were left without supplies. The killings were not chaotic. They were selective. Cornelius, notably, did not carry out the violence himself. He reportedly injured a foot during the wreck and was physically limited. Instead, he relied on a small circle of loyal followers to enforce decisions. That detail matters, because it shifts the narrative away from frenzy. This was administration, distorted and brutal, but organized. And as the number of survivors decreased, resistance became more dangerous. But it did not disappear. Unbeknownst to Cornelius, a separate group of soldiers had been sent earlier to search for water on another island. They found it, and they did not intend to submit. That is where the balance began to change. The group Cornelius considered most dangerous were the soldiers. They were trained, they were armed, and they were not dependent on him for authority in the same way civilians were. So early on, a number of them were sent to a separate island. Officially, the task was practical. Search for fresh water, survey the area, report back. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it removed a potential threat. But the plan did not unfold the way Cornelius expected. The soldiers, led by a man named Wiebbe Hayes, did find fresh water. That discovery changed everything, because access to water meant autonomy. They were no longer isolated victims waiting for instructions. They had resources. They also understood, gradually, that something was wrong. Men sent between islands failed to return. Rumors began to circulate, and survivors who managed to escape from Cornelius's faction brought accounts of deliberate killings. At that point, the situation shifted from uncertainty to clarity. Hayes and his group began preparing defensively. Archaeological excavations on the islands have confirmed the remains of crude stone fortifications, low walls constructed from coral limestone. They were not symbolic, they were practical, which tells us something important. The resistance was organized. This was not a last-minute panic response. It was structured preparation for conflict. Meanwhile, on Cornelius's side, the killings continued. According to trial records, loyalty was tested. Those who hesitated were eliminated. Violence became both a tool of control and a method of reducing the population to a manageable size. That second point is disturbing but documented. With limited supplies and no immediate rescue in sight, Reducing the number of survivors simplified distribution. It also reduced opposition. Eventually, Cornelius decided to confront the soldiers directly. The assumption seems to have been that a surprise attack would overpower them. Instead, the opposite happened. Hayes's group resisted. They fought back. And in the confrontation that followed, Cornelius was captured. Not killed immediately, captured, which is an important distinction, because authority, once fractured, was about to shift again. While the killings were unfolding on the islands, Pelsaert was still at sea. The longboat journey itself took over a month, roughly 3,000 kilometers. Open ocean, limited supplies. The fact that they reached Batavia at all is notable. When they arrived, the situation was presented as a shipwreck. There was no report of massacre, no account of systematic violence. At that stage, the scale of what was happening on the islands was unknown. Pelsaert requested assistance. The Dutch East India Company authorized a rescue vessel. That response is documented in company correspondence from Batavia. The wreck was a commercial loss. The silver cargo mattered. Survivors mattered. But the company did not yet know it was about to confront something far worse than maritime miscalculation. It took several weeks to organize the return voyage, which means that during the period when authority was being restructured on the islands, formal authority was very much intact elsewhere. That contrast is worth noticing. On one side of the ocean, corporate procedure, administrative order, written approvals. On the other, isolation. Fragmented command, violence carried out without oversight. When Cornelius was captured by Wiebbe Hayes and the soldiers, the violence did not instantly disappear, but its direction changed. For the first time since the wreck, the faction that had been carrying out the killings was no longer in control. Cornelius was held under guard. His closest followers were disarmed, and those who had aligned themselves with him began to distance themselves quickly. Survival instincts shift when power shifts. Hayes did not attempt to create a new regime. There was no declaration of leadership. Instead, what appears in the records is something simpler: containment. The immediate goal was to prevent further deaths until rescue, if it came, arrived. Communication between the islands became more cautious. Small boats moved carefully between positions. Those who had been hiding or isolated began to re-emerge. The atmosphere, according to later testimony, was tense but no longer predatory. What's striking is that Hayes' group did not execute Cornelius themselves. They waited. That decision suggests something important. Even in isolation, they understood that formal judgment belonged to company authority. They restrained him. They preserved witnesses. They preserved evidence, which, given what had happened, is not the most instinctive reaction. It implies that despite weeks of violence, the idea of external accountability still mattered. So, by the time sails appeared on the horizon weeks later, the situation on the islands was unstable, but no longer spiraling. Cornelius was alive, his followers were alive, and dozens of survivors were waiting to explain what had taken place. Pelsaert had been away for nearly 2 months. The longboat journey to Batavia took over 30 days. Securing a rescue vessel required additional time. The return voyage was not immediate. By the time he stepped ashore again, roughly 9 weeks had passed since the wreck. That span matters, because what he returned to was no longer an emergency. It was aftermath. Cornelius was presented to him alive. So were several of the men accused of carrying out killings. And what Pelsaert encountered first was not violence, but explanation. Survivors began speaking. Not all at once, not in a unified narrative, but in fragments. Names surfaced repeatedly. Specific islands were mentioned. Descriptions of drownings, of isolated victims sent away under false instructions. The pattern became visible through comparison. Pelsaert began recording formal statements. These were not casual conversations. They were structured interrogations. Accused men were questioned separately. Witnesses were re-examined. Inconsistencies were noted and revisited. Some confessed quickly. Others resisted, then shifted their accounts when confronted with testimony from others. What survives in the Dutch East India Company archives today comes largely from these island interrogations, later compiled into official reports. Through these proceedings, it became clear that the killings had not been random acts of panic. They had been organized. Cornelisz admitted that before the wreck, there had been discussion of seizing the ship and eliminating opposition. He maintained that the reef disrupted those plans. But once stranded, he attempted to rebuild them in a different form. He did not deny directing others. He denied being the one who physically carried out most of the murders. That distinction, to him, mattered. To Pelsaert, it did not. The return of company authority changed the atmosphere almost immediately. Weapons were redistributed under supervision. Guards were posted. Movement between islands was controlled again. For the first time since the wreck, there was a recognized chain of command. And once statements were gathered and confessions compared, sentences followed quickly. The trials were not postponed for transport to Batavia. They were conducted there, on the islands, publicly. Cornelisz was condemned. Before his execution, both of his hands were cut off, a punishment reflecting both mutilation and symbolic removal of agency under Dutch legal custom. He was then hanged. Several of his closest associates were executed in the following days. Others were flogged or otherwise punished. 2 men were intentionally abandoned on the Australian mainland, effectively exiled without return. Captain Arjen Jacobs, whose role centered on the earlier conspiracy rather than the island killings, was not executed there. He was placed under arrest and sent back to the Dutch Republic for further legal review. After the sentences were carried out, the company turned to practical matters. Salvage operations resumed. Silver was recovered where possible. The surviving passengers were transported onward. Administratively, the Batavia incident closed as both a shipwreck and a criminal rebellion. But the time gap, those weeks without external oversight, remained embedded in the record, not as chaos, but as documented procedure interrupted, and then reimposed. Before moving further into the trials, we need to pause on one question. Why did the killings begin? The records do not suggest random violence driven by hunger alone. Food and water were limited, yes, but the pattern of deaths points elsewhere. Men identified as strong or potentially resistant were removed early. Soldiers were separated. Individuals who questioned decisions disappeared. According to multiple confessions, Cornelisz had previously discussed seizing control of the ship during the voyage. After the wreck, the opportunity shifted, but the objective did not. What could not be taken at sea could be consolidated on land. Reducing the number of survivors simplified resource distribution, but it also simplified opposition. The killings functioned as both control and preemption, not frenzy, not collapse, but an attempt to restructure authority under new conditions. What makes the Batavia difficult to sit with isn't only the number of deaths, it's how procedural the violence became. The reef was an accident, the killings were not. And what stands out in the records is not chaos, but administration. Lists, assignments, orders carried out by intermediaries. For weeks, in isolation, structure did not disappear. It reassembled, just differently. When Pelsaert returned, formal company authority resumed almost immediately. Interrogations were structured. Punishments followed established legal custom. Silver was inventoried. The machinery of order restarted. Which raises a quieter question. Was the violence an aberration, or was it another form of hierarchy, stripped of oversight, but still organized? It's tempting to describe the episode as madness, but the documentation doesn't read that way. It reads as ambition meeting opportunity. Isolation removed accountability, and for a time, that was enough. If you've encountered archival material that shifts this interpretation, or if you see the motivations differently, I'd genuinely be interested to hear your thoughts. And if there's another historical episode you'd like explored in a future installment of History Explained Before Sleep, feel free to suggest it. We'll explore another chapter of history soon.